The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic series in all of gaming, and also happens to be my personal favorite. I've set out to rank every main series game and compile the ultimate Zelda series ranking. In this video, we are looking at one half of the Oracle series originally released on the Game Boy Color in 2001, The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons. We will be scoring the game across these 10 categories. Each category will be scored from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Each category score is being chosen in relation to the other games in the series. At the end, everything will be averaged out to get our final result. A quick note, this review will not be covering the events of the linked ending when both Seasons and Ages is completed. The linked ending content will eventually be covered in the review of Ages. However, to be as charitable as possible for both games, the linked content will be considered in the scoring for this review of Seasons as well as the future review of Ages. Make sure to stick around to the end of this video where I will reveal how the next Zelda game review will be chosen following this one. Now let's get started. Oracle of Seasons opens up with Link riding on his horse. Spying a castle on the horizon, he goes inside and is sent by the Triforce to help a land being ravaged by the ruthless General Onyx. Link is teleported to the land of Holodrum, and after a bit of exploring, discovers a traveling troupe. After hanging around and dancing with the troupe's main attraction, Din, the sky becomes dark and General Onyx strikes. In the ensuing chaos, Din's revealed to be the Oracle of Seasons, gets kidnapped, taken to Onyx's mountain fortress, and imprisoned inside of a crystal. As a result, the Temple of Seasons falls into the earth, and the seasons of the land begin to become erratic. Link embarks on a quest to save Din and restore order. The young hero learns from the Maku tree that in order to penetrate the center of Onyx's fortress, he needs to collect 8 essences of nature. While in the process of visiting the dungeons, Link spies a shady character moving in the weeds. He sneaks by her and the girl disappears. After some exploration, he uncovers a strange-looking portal. Stepping onto it, he is teleported to the lava hut underground land of Subrosia. Looking to his left, he sees the missing Temple of Seasons. Taking the Rod of Seasons that he borrowed from the temple itself, he learns to harness the power of the seasons, which end up being useful for his quest to retrieve the 8 essences of nature. After finishing the last of the dungeons and destroying Onyx and his evil dragon alter ego, Din is released and the seasons become regular once again. However, the adventure is far from over. The flame of destruction is already lit by the destruction Onyx caused. Observing Link from afar, a mysterious pair laughs, saying the true evil had yet to arrive. The story is getting a score of a 1 out of 5. You know, I've heard the Oracle series originally started as a remake of the original Legend of Zelda, which of course we do see elements of that still remaining in the game, but that doesn't mean you should copy the bare bones storytelling of the original too. I think Oracle of Seasons may be the weakest story in all of Zelda, especially if we exclude the NES games. We get a story intro at the beginning with Onyx capturing Din and then learning of our quest to collect all of the essences, but then absolutely no plot developments until the end of the game. There are a couple nice side character moments like going on a little date in Subrosia and a nice little joyride with the pirate crew, but the main plot is extremely weak. The main point of contention here is that we know they could have done better, because they do a much better job with the story in the game that was made alongside this one in Ages. We can also look to Link's Awakening as a great story as well, so hardware limitations are off the table here. A much deserved score of 1. The world of Holodrum and Oracle of Seasons initially seems like a pretty standard Zelda overworld, basically like a remixed version of the Link's Awakening map. However, the map becomes more and more interesting as you unlock each of the seasons. The entire map basically has 4 versions of it, with different areas and things available depending on the season. The idea of using particular seasons to either traverse the map or reach certain items is truly amazing, but I do think the execution wasn't as great as it could have been. Once you unlock all 4 seasons and get a feel for what you can do during each season, the overworld puzzles don't really evolve to take things to the next level, so the season mechanic feels like it didn't reach the heights that it could have. In addition to the overworld, we do have an underworld, if you will, that is the subterranean lava world known as Subrosia. Due to the Temple of Seasons sinking down to Subrosia at the start of the game, Link must journey here several times during his adventure to get certain items and unlock seasons for the Rod of Seasons. Subrosia is a nice change of pace and is a very charming and amusing area to visit. The world gets a 3 out of 5. Holodrum is pretty much on par with what you'd expect from a typical 2D Zelda overworld, but does have the nice wrinkle of having the ability to manipulate the seasons throughout the entire map. I would have maybe rated this a little bit lower if it wasn't for the addition of Subrosia to help mix things up a little bit and add a little bit more personality to a game that sorely needs it. I'm going to cut to the chase here. The art style of Oracle of Seasons is directly lifted from Link's Awakening DX, and that's my main issue. Don't get me wrong, I really have no issues with that art style. Given the limitations of the Game Boy Color, I think it looks very solid. That being said, it makes it harder for the Oracle games to stand out when they look exactly the same. Maybe it's because when I first played the Game Boy Color games over 10 years ago, I started with Link's Awakening and then played Ages, then Seasons all back to back. By the time I finished Seasons, I was so tired of the music and art style that maybe I've built up a negative bias towards it. All I'm saying is I wish the Oracle games maybe made a few tweaks to Link's character sprite and maybe a few more assets to make things feel a little more different. To their credit, there are new enemies, NPCs, and bosses. The art style gets a 2 out of 5. It still looks great for a Game Boy Color game, but it is a bit difficult to get me to get past 80% of the assets being directly lifted from Link's Awakening. For a Zelda game on the Game Boy Color, the combat is about as good as you could possibly hope for. Sword slashes have a nice big arcing motion, making it easy to take out enemies. Item combat also generally works pretty well, with only one minor hiccup that I'll get into in the item section. If there's one issue I have with the combat and the general gameplay, it's that you just aren't given enough invincibility frames after you've taken damage, which makes it really easy to take more than one hit in any given scenario. I just found it a little bit harsh with how easily you could stack up the amount of damage you take. This isn't just an Oracle of Seasons problem, it certainly is an issue in the other Game Boy Color Zelda games, but with Seasons being the most action-heavy of the bunch, it is ever more apparent. Now, speaking of the title of being the action Oracle game versus the puzzle-based Oracle game, which was Ages, the unofficial action tagline wasn't given to Seasons just for its combat, but also for its stronger emphasis on platforming. So even more than Link's Awakening in Ages, we see a lot more platforming sequences. Now, the side-scrolling sequences were all well and good, save for a few instances. I've played more than enough 2D side-scrolling games to be fairly comfortable with that type of gameplay. But the top-down platforming really started to wear me down as the difficulty of these sequences increased. As you start to combine items like the seeds that make you run faster and the Rock's Cape, the platforming starts to get pretty wild and it had me frustrated. The controls for the top-down platforming just felt really slippery and it was very difficult to be as precise as I wanted to be. It doesn't surprise me at all that Ages has long been considered the superior counterpart in the Oracle series, because I think a more puzzle-heavy game just fits the style of the Game Boy Color so much more than trying to jam in a lot of combat and precise top-down platforming. Gameplay gets a 3 out of 5. The combat is completely serviceable, save for a lot of the cheap damage that you will likely take, but the platforming sequences get really tired by the end. Aside from the standard items we have seen before in Link's Awakening, such as bombs, the power ring, the Roc's Feather, we have some new welcome additions. One of the more interesting items is the magnetic gloves. The gloves have both a negative and positive setting that alternate each time you press the item button. You'll either find yourself moving towards or away from a magnetic object, including over dangerous gaps, or you'll be moving objects away or towards you. I found this item to be most fun when you had to maneuver between these little magnetic conveyor belt things. It made for some interesting dungeon rooms. Upgrading the Roc's Feather will get you the Roc's Cape, which lets you jump and then glide. This helps you get across large gaps and even larger gaps if you pair it with the Pegasus Seeds. The Magic Boomerang is a great idea on paper. After throwing the boomerang, you have the ability to control its path. But in actual practice, with the lack of buttons available, it felt really weird to control, and I would often end up moving Link around when I wasn't intending to, and sometimes even taking damage because of it. The Seed Satchel was quite useful, with various seeds with different functions. Mystery Seeds would activate statues for hints and harm certain enemies, Fire Seeds would do damage, and Tornado Seeds allowed you to warp across the map. We also have the Slingshot, which eventually upgrades to a triple shot. I like that because it used the seeds from the Seed Satchel, so you could have different ammo depending on the context of the situation. Finally, one of the more interesting items we have are the magic rings. Rings were scattered all around the map between the overworld and dungeons, and they needed to be appraised by the ring shopkeeper. Upon getting them appraised, you'll discover that each ring has its own unique function. Different rings have different abilities, including increased bomb damage or extra defense from BMOs. It took me a bit into the game to finally understand what was going on with these rings, but once I did, I found it really cool. The rings allowed you to best equip yourself based on your playstyle. The items get a 4 out of 5. The Roc's Cape and magnetic gloves are some of the coolest items in 2D Zelda, and the inclusion of the ring system really added a whole new element to the game that is totally up to the player to decide or even ignore if they want to. In Oracle of Seasons, we are tasked with collecting 8 essences of nature, each which reside in their own dungeon. The first dungeon in the game is the Gnarled Root Dungeon. The entrance is a nice little throwback to the original Legend of Zelda. It's a fairly standard but not easy start. You'll be introduced to many things that you'll see get more complicated in future dungeons, such as the minecarts. The most challenging part is at this point you likely only have 3 hearts, which can make things like the mini-boss pretty easy to die on. Dungeon 2, Snake's Remains, is fairly straightforward. The only thing that tripped me up was not realizing that the power bracelet could now push these rollers. Not much else to say here. Dungeon 3 is where things start to heat up. This is the first dungeon that really feels large. It feels like the rooms just keep going and going. The hazards take a pretty big step up here as well, with some pretty wild rooms. The puzzles also take an increase in difficulty. There's a memorable statue puzzle, as well as one where you have to move a trampoline to move up to the next level. Dancing Dragon Dungeon. This dungeon gave me quite a bit of trouble. The Dancing Dragon Dungeon was a step up in terms of platforming difficulty, and the dungeon also featured a more complicated minecart situation. I spent well over an hour in this one. The mini-boss gave me quite a bit of trouble too, but we'll get to that later. Dungeon 5 is the Unicorn Cave. This is basically the Magnet Dungeon. One of the game's coolest items is put on display here with a lot of interesting puzzles and challenging situations. The Ancient Ruins was one of the more annoying dungeons. It had a central wheel puzzle that you had to deal with, and the mini-boss just happened so late in the dungeon that if you died, it was a long walk back to get to where you left off. The only saving grace was that the mini-boss warp was close enough to retry the final boss if you died. The Explorer's Crypt was the 7th dungeon, and this was a heck of a slog. I clocked in 1 hour and 37 minutes going through this thing. The dungeon was just a culmination of everything the previous ones had thrown at you. Tough platforming, magnet puzzles, trampolines. They also had this one room with Armo statues that made you have to redo the puzzle every time. I can't tell you how many times I had to do that stupid puzzle while I was either progressing, lost, exploring, or any combination of the three. My god, the whiz robes that they throw at you at the end. It takes a lot of patience to get through this one. The 8th and final major dungeon is the Sword and Shield Maze, very much the ice dungeon of the game. I clocked in 1 hour and 43 minutes on this one. This dungeon is just insane with ice block puzzles and freezing a floor of lava. It has to be up there as one of the toughest 2D Zelda dungeons. Some of the platforming moments made me want to cry. This one particular side-scrolling ice platform section left me in agony. I'm pretty sure there's a circle of hell that is just being stuck in this sequence for the rest of eternity. Finally, we have Onyx's Castle. I like how they keep things short and sweet here, just enough challenge and build up for the final boss. Dungeons get a 3 out of 5. Oracle of Seasons dungeons focus on having sprawling layouts riddled with enemies. There was some dungeons I enjoyed, and there were a few that really tested my patience. That being said, the dungeons all had me enjoying the exploration and also thinking about what to do next and where to go. I never felt like it was just a walk in the park and I was just going through the motions. This dungeon style may not be my cup of tea all the time, but I respect the challenge even if it could be exhausting at times. The standard enemies are mostly rehashed from Link's Awakening, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. All the expected enemies are here: Keys, Moblins, Stalfos, Octoroks. Given that it's the same hardware as the DX version, I wouldn't really think there was much room to rework them in any way. We also get a few new additions to the Game Boy Color Zelda, such as Lynels and these magnet dudes. There were also a few notable mini-bosses. Omawi was a seriously intense battle that had me at the edge of my seat. You had to really have the timing down to get through this one a lot. Aghanima is no dollar store Aghanim, that's for sure. There's 2 fake ones and 1 real one. I couldn't figure out how to tell the difference at first, so this boss beat me up bad. It's a long walk back to this boss too, so it broke me enough to look up how to actually beat it. Turns out you just have to look for the one with the shadow. Once you know that, it's not too bad, but the extra wrinkle in this fight makes it more challenging than other similar fights in the series. Fry Polar is a fire and ice boss. You use mystery seeds to change it from fire to ice, and then fire seeds to change it back, all while doing damage. It was pretty easy to figure out and just went on a bit too long. Now we get to the actual bosses. Ladies and gentlemen, the good old boys are back because nearly all the bosses are throwbacks to the original Legend of Zelda, but with a fresh coat of paint. Aquamentus is much more fierce than he looked in the original. This is one boss that plays basically the same as the original, but I think that works here because it's the first dungeon boss just as it was in the first game. Dodongo is the second dungeon boss and is the fight that you would pretty much expect it to be. Get it to eat a bomb to incapacitate it, but the new mechanic is that you use your power bracelet to lift it up and then throw it onto the spikes. I can be a bit of a space cadet sometimes because it took me way too long to realize that I had to throw him onto the spikes. I just kept feeding him bombs over and over and wondering why the fight wasn't over yet. Finally it dawned on me and it was a walk in the park from there. Mothula is more of an homage to A Link to the Past. It can be a pretty quick fight if you spam sword slashes on it as fast as possible, but if you fall down through the gaps, then you have to start over. So you have to be quite careful because it's pretty easy to get knocked back and fall down. Goma once again makes an appearance. First you have to destroy the giant claw that protects its eye. Once destroyed, now it's time to do the classic arrow to the eye to win. Goma will close its eyes quite a bit, so it can actually be pretty challenging to time it and not get hit. Be careful who you make fun of in middle school because Dig Dogger is back and is not messing around. This might be the boss that had the biggest glow up from the original Legend of Zelda. What was once a joke of a boss in Legend of Zelda where you just played a flute and then bombed it to insta-kill it has now become one of the most interesting and challenging bosses in the game. In this encounter, you must use your magnet gloves to push and pull a steel ball into Dig Dogger. Timing is everything and you have to be paying close attention to which mode your gloves are in since you alternate between pushing and pulling it. The next phase, Dig Dogger splits into a bunch of little eyeball guys and you have to destroy all of them to win, but you only have so much time before he reforms. so you are going back and forth between these two phases until the last little guy is destroyed. This was a really tough fight, but honestly, I loved it, and I'm happy to see Dig Dugger here get some redemption. Manhandla was another boss that was quite easy in the original, and things get much harder in Seasons, where you're put in a room with a floor shifting you in all directions as you try to defeat Manhandla. Use your boomerang to destroy each of the heads. Once you survive that, there is a final phase where you must open up the last piece of the boss and destroy the jewel in the middle. Gleeok was pretty tough for me in the original. In the Seasons version, I found to actually be easier. Probably because it came later in the game, I was more prepared, and I do also think the design itself is a bit easier to deal with. The first phase works pretty much like the original, try and destroy the heads and not get hit. Gleeok will then turn into a skeleton where it crashes all around the room. You really have to stay on top of using your Rock's Cape to stay in the air whenever it crashes, otherwise you're going to get stunned and take damage very quickly. It takes a bit to get the timing down, but once you do, it's not too bad. Making a cameo from Castlevania, we have the Medusa head, and believe it or not, it's less annoying than its Castlevania counterpart. With how tough the Sword and Shield maze is, I was surprised at how easy this boss was. It's the only boss in the second half of the game that I actually one-shotted. As long as you use your Rock's Cape, it's quite easy to dodge all of the boss's projectiles. Finally, we have General Onyx. I think Onyx is legit one of the hardest Zelda final bosses. The first phase involves using your Spin Slash to damage Onyx while he basically acts like a giant iron knuckle, swinging his mace around. Be careful though, because he will occasionally send boulders down on you. In the next phase, he brings the Oracle Din into the fold to protect himself, and you have to use the Rod of Seasons of all things to bat Din away so that you can hit Onyx. You never use the Rod of Seasons offensively in any way the whole game, so it takes some 500 IQ energy to figure out that this is the item you have to use in this situation. He will also shoot these tornado things at you, which are super hard to dodge, so the idea is to eventually get good enough to get through the first two phases fast enough that he doesn't have a chance to use these tornadoes. Finally, the last phase, Onyx is a freaking dragon. The idea is to jump on his hands and slash the jewel in his face. Onyx will shoot fire and other projectiles, along with sweeping his hands across the screen to damage you. The first two phases you can get good at pretty quickly, but it takes a lot of time and patience to be able to beat the final Onyx phase. It took me numerous tries, and I highly recommend getting a potion for this one, which of course I didn't even know existed until the end of the game. The bosses get a 5 out of 5. This may come as a surprise to some, as I don't hear many people talking about the bosses in this game, but I think it's a very underrated aspect of Seasons. I love the idea of bringing back old classic bosses and adding new mechanics to make them more interesting, and Onyx is also one of the most intense final bosses. We also have Twin Rova and Ganon being considered here, since I did say I would factor in linked play elements. Though as I said, I'll actually cover that material in the future Ages review. With solid enemies, mini-bosses, and regular bosses, I think this 5 is much deserved here. If you've played other 2D Zelda games, the side content is not too far from what you would expect. There are plenty of heart pieces to collect throughout Holodrum. Aside from collecting those, your two other major sources of side content include collecting rings and doing the trade sequence. The trading sequence I found to be a lot more fun than when it was previously featured in Link's Awakening. This was mostly because it was optional, so I was able to take it at my own pace, and because I enjoyed the reward more as well, which that reward was a sword upgrade. The nice thing is that you can carry this upgrade into your playthrough of Ages and then upgrade it even further. I previously mentioned the benefit of collecting rings in the gameplay section, but another thing about the rings I appreciate is that they threw in some fun ones as well for the heck of it. For example, there's one that lets you even be an Octorok. Not exactly the most practical thing to use, but it sure is hilarious and definitely encourages you to collect more to see what other strange abilities you can get. Side content gets a 3 out of 5. Seasons has a perfectly serviceable amount of content to keep you busy if you're up for it, but it doesn't go above and beyond what you would expect from a typical Zelda game. I wouldn't say Oracle of Seasons is known for its super memorable music. It of course borrows a few tracks from Link's Awakening, and understandably so, same system and everything. The game does have many tracks of its own though. There are a few notable ones. Some of the highlights include the Subrosia theme, the Skeleton Pirate theme, and finally the Dancing Dragon dungeon. The dungeon itself, I could take it or leave it, but that theme slaps harder than it has any right to. Music gets a 2 out of 5. It's far from the worst in the series, but there's just not quite enough here to find myself going back to it. Oracle of Seasons is paced pretty darn well. It could have used a few more story beats along the way, but if we were talking about gameplay experience, Seasons rarely gets in its own way. It's a nice steady pace of doing tasks to get to a dungeon, and then finish said dungeon, rinse and repeat. The sequences between dungeons vary in length, so it doesn't get boring one way or the other. Probably my only complaint was that the sequence of collecting the gems to get into the ancient ruins was just too vague for my liking. It was one of the few points in the game where I just had to throw my hands up and look for a guide because there was no way I was figuring it out. This was a pretty minor issue though altogether. Pacing gets a 5 out of 5. Aside from the segment I just mentioned with the ancient ruins, I'd say gameplay wise, Oracle of Seasons is paced perfectly. There's no segment that feels like padding, and certainly no segments of long dialogue or exposition. In fact, the game could have used more of that, but I won't count it against it, at least in this category. Before we get to the final score, I'd just like to say it was nice to give Oracle of Seasons another chance. It had been over 10 years since I had last played it, and the context in which I played it last left me not feeling too great about it. Having gone back, I feel much more positive about the game, and I'm excited to eventually get to its counterpart game, Oracle of Ages. So we've gone through every category, and here is the recap of each of the scores. The scores average out to a 3.1 out of 5. We've covered Skyward Sword, the original Legend of Zelda, Phantom Hourglass, and the Wind Waker in previous videos, so here is where we stand with all 5 games. As we rate each game, we will continue to populate this list and slowly build the Ultimate Zelda series ranking. Make sure to let me know in the comments how you would rank Oracle of Seasons, and for our next review, you, the audience, will decide. If you're watching this video within a week of it being published, keep an eye out for a community post. There will be 2 Zelda games to pick from, and vote for the next Zelda review. I look forward to seeing the results, and I'll see you guys next time.